all, I would like to thank Region 3 for partnering with Region 2 to provide this webinar. We're always grateful to share speakers from our regions, and we're glad to do this with you all. Land acknowledgements are an honest and historically accurate way to recognize Native communities of this land. Presenting land acknowledgements recognizes histories that have been systematically erased. The Native peoples of this land include Etowah, Kiowa, Santee, Edisto, Natchez Kuso, and Wassamasaw people. The Region 2 RML recognizes the Native communities of the land on which we live and work in Charleston, South Carolina. So let's take a moment to do labor acknowledgements. Labor acknowledgements recognize how historically much of the substantial economic development in a geographic area or industry resulted from the unpaid labor and forced servitude of people of color, specifically people from Africa. The Region 2 RML acknowledges that much of what we know of this country today was possible because of the labor of enslaved Africans, their descendants, immigrant workers, impoverished people, domestic workers, and others. We commit to remaining mindful to use our work to support the health and well-being of all people, including those whose labor has been historically exploited. And then we really want this to be a safe space for everyone. So please make sure and take care of yourself. If you need to have a sip of water, like we're all here and want you to take care of yourself and be well. No one knows everything. Together we know a lot. So we're listening to understand. Make space and take space. Be aware of how much you are speaking. If you're speaking a lot, be mindful to make space for those with quieter voices, especially those from marginalized groups. And then one mic, one voice. Only one person should speak at a time. Speak from your own experiences. Do not assume other people's experiences or generalize. And then understand the difference between impact and intent. What you are intending is less important than how it might impact another person. Respect confidentiality, that's really important. What we learn here leaves here. What we say here, though, stays here. And be curious and respectful. Be a mindful listener. Do not blame or shame. This is adapted from the GLSEN Guidelines for Respectful GSA Spaces. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to introduce our speaker in just one moment. All right. It is my pleasure to introduce Christy Peters, she, her pronouns. Christy Peters is head of the Area Studies, Humanities, and Social Sciences Department at Washington University of St. Louis, WashU Libraries. Prior to WashU, Christy served as head of the Science and Engineering Library at the University of Kentucky Libraries. Current efforts include development and coordination of WashU Libraries' participation in the university's prison education project and advocacy for neuroinclusion in libraries. Regarding the latter, Christy presented the session Becoming a Neuroinclusive Manager, Moving Beyond Awareness at the Conference on Academic Library Management in June 2023. Today, she will give the presentation Neurodiversity, Invisible Disability, and Unconscious Bias, the Primary Obstacle of Neuroinclusion in the Workplace. Thank you, Christy, for being here today. Let's get started. I'm going to let Christy share her screen. Perfect, thank you. Christy, you are muted.
Of course I am. Okay, so can you see my presentation? Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. All right, I will get started. So again, thank you all for being here. I am so excited to share this with you. As you can see from my pronoun statement, I also have ADHD. This is something that I have, until recently, not shouted out loud, but I'm shouting it out loud now, every opportunity I get. I actually saw this practice of including your neurodiverse identity in your pronoun statement on Neurodiversity YouTube. It seems to be becoming more common, and I have it on all of my Zooms all the time with everybody, so they know. All right. I will not spend a lot of time on this. It is really just to point out that I was diagnosed later in life with ADHD very shortly after starting my first academic library job in 2009. Thanks to very dear friends who were willing to share with me some of their thoughts about the ways that I, interacted with the world at work. And I have informally disclosed this to peers and coworkers and managers in the past. I have never formally disclosed or asked for a formal accommodation, but I do think it's important for people who are comfortable doing so, being overt about their identities to make others who may not be comfortable doing so to take that chance. And I informally disclosed until COVID times, right, in 2020, and had always been very successful. And while COVID, I think we all agree, really affected the mental health of everyone around the world, whether neurodiverse or not, I would argue it affected neurodiverse employees more so than others. And in the fall of 21, just as we were going back to work, my body broke down. I mean, for a year and a half almost, I was diagnosed with a remarkable range of physical maladies that I really do associate with burnout and illness. I never really appreciated the physical impact that stress and burnout can have on a person until that time. But I am back, I'm feeling better, and I am sharing this information with people every opportunity I can. All right, so neurodiversity basics. I know this is listed as a beginner course. I am not going to spend an awful lot of time on neurodiversity basics because I feel like this audience probably has a grasp of what neurodiversity is. I will spend more time on talking about stigma, discrimination, and unconscious bias, and disability law and reasonable accommodation. I really only have 2 neuro-friendly recommendations as sort of examples of ways we can support all employees in an organization, whether neurodiverse or not, without requiring disclosure of people. I think it demonstrates ways that we can be neuroinclusive across the board. Organizational justice, I'm also very passionate about. I think it's very related. I may not get there. I want to leave time for questions, but I wanted to include the slides that you can look at after the fact because I do think it is very important. So neurodiversity basics. Neurodiversity really refers to differences, individual differences in cognitive, neurological brain function, right? And we're concerned with how that affects the ability for people to successfully work in libraries in this case. And it is an invisible disability. I put disability in quotes very intentionally because not all neurodiverse individuals identify as disabled. I do not identify as disabled, but we are neurodiverse individuals and others with invisible disabilities, because neurodiversity is not the only invisible disability, are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. In terms of how neurodiversity really fits within the DEI framework, again, we're talking diversity of cognitive function. Equity equals accommodation when it comes to neurodiversity. And I may say that more than once because I feel like it is really important for people to understand that accommodation is an essential aspect of neuroinclusion in the workplace. Inclusion, of course, meaning acceptance, not acceptance if you fit in to an organization the way you were expected to, but acceptance of you as you are. And belonging means affinity and well-being. Success in my mind is not simply being able to get the job done, right? It's feeling good about it, being happy, feeling committed to the organization. And I feel like a lot of times when we talk about DEI, the belonging part is left out. Neurodiversity in the workplace, there are many different ways it can affect individuals in the workplace. Communication challenges tend to be the most apparent or obvious. Making space, one of the community agreements at the beginning, that is something that I always actively work on, because I can be that person, right, who takes up too much space. But atypical social behavior, social anxiety, hypersensitivity. I don't know if you have heard of the term highly sensitive person. I consider myself to be a highly sensitive person. Sensitivity historically has been really stigmatized and looked down upon. I do not believe that it has to be so. It may require some self-management, right? But there are many benefits to being highly sensitive in the workplace as well. Distractibility, inability to focus. And, I don't want to forget fear based on past experience with stigma and discrimination, because that's something I think many of us just don't really consider when we're thinking about how people are behaving or existing in a workplace. So I can't really talk about neurodiversity without talking about intersectionality, because one of the complications with disability law is that, there are no set acceptable accommodations for anyone based on a single diagnosis. I have struggled tremendously with neurodiversity, especially since COVID in 2020. And I am a cis white woman working in a profession that I would argue is dominated by cis white women, right? And the struggle has been real. If you come from a poor area, you are a minority, you have other complex identities, the struggle for you could be exponentially greater than it has been for me. And I know that I read a study recently that pointed out that young white boys are free when they are diagnosed with ADHD at a young age, right? Where comparatively, Black boys of the same age are more often diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder. That is stigmatization, right? And that happens at every level in society. And that stigma stays with individuals throughout their life, and it affects how they perceive acceptance in the workplace. And I just think it's really important to make note of that. Neurodiversity as a concept was developed in the late 90s as a way to include neurodiversity on this intersectionality framework and pull it out of disability. Because while some neurodiverse individuals do identify as disabled, others do not, right? So it's a way to give it sort of equal weight when we're talking about things. Comorbidity is also something really important to consider. And another reason why it's impossible to say, this accommodation is going to be appropriate for all people who have this neurodiverse condition, right? 50% of people with ADHD have dyslexia. I had no idea. And I was really interested in the number that 70% of people with ADHD have autism spectrum disorder traits, right? So, if a person tells you they have ADHD, that might not be their only sort of neuro diverse identity, right? When you're talking about how they interact in the workplace. When you look at these things together, you can see how complicated it really is. to make sure you were being neuroinclusive of everyone, irrespective of their identity. All right, so stigma, discrimination, and unconscious bias, I think, is really important to discuss, because I think while most of us in the library profession, we do not think we stigmatize and discriminate against people, but many times it happens unconsciously. And I do not believe that unconscious bias can be an excuse anymore, right? For claiming ignorance that you did something that affected somebody in a way that was harmful. Neurodiversity is considered a concealable stigmatized identity, or CSI. These are identities that are socially devalued with negative stereotypes and beliefs attached, both conscious and unconscious. And again, I am focused really more on the unconscious bias associated with concealable stigmatized identities. I really feel like the media, right? Social media, television, movies, they spin neurodiversity in such a way that it's all about extremes, right? Extreme positives, extreme negatives. They use words to refer to people that really just seep into our brains without us really knowing it, right? So I think it's something that we just have to be actively working towards, eliminating that unconscious bias as much as possible. So I think most of us know what stigma is. I did point out here several different types of stigma. So enacted stigma is really what, we would consider direct discrimination, right? You are overtly stigmatizing or discriminating against an individual. I have heard and read, so I've heard personally, and I've read in the literature, many people argue, of course, it would be better for an employee to disclose their invisible disability, their neurodiversity, their CSI. And literature shows that largely people do see positive results when they disclose. But, it doesn't take into account the lived experience of any individual up to the time when they were hired at your organization, right? They could have had a lifetime of enacted stigma of direct discrimination. And, I think we have to be conscious of the fact that while, we may not feel like we would be that person, it is not unreasonable for people in the workplace to fear that is going to happen. And I think that is largely the reason people are afraid to disclose, because there have been, active negative repercussions for some individuals for doing so. And, neurodiverse individuals also see the TV shows and are on the social media and watching the movies. And, when you grow up, whether you're neurodiverse or not, but you sort of associate with some of the things you see or hear on the media, you begin to believe it yourself, right? So even if it's not true, you have to recognize that that may be something that individuals in the workplace are dealing with as well. So ableism, I think most of us have heard of. Discrimination based on physical ability. Saneism, you may not have heard of. It is basically ableism referring to cognitive difference very particularly. With that said, I still see ableism more often in the literature, even when used in the context of neurodiversity. And here are some of the words that you may have heard in the past in the workplace associated with individuals, right? You may feel like someone is unfriendly or moody or careless. If you're a manager, You might feel like an employee is needy or difficult or lazy, without really understanding why a person is acting differently than you expect them to. And when you say these things out loud, other people hear them, both the individuals they're referred to and that individual's peers and colleagues and coworkers. And it can affect not only the individual, right, but the perceptions of their coworkers and peers and other individuals in an organization. So just be very conscious when you are, if one of these words, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, think hard about how you talk about people in the workplace, because often that will get back to them, even if you are not saying it to their face. So direct discrimination, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. I think most of us understand what direct discrimination is. Legally, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, this would be called disparate treatment. Indirect discrimination is something that I feel like we are much less aware of, but I feel like it's incredibly important for us to talk about. Legally, this is called disparate impact, and these are practices that are applicable to all, irrespective of protected status. And I think not only in libraries and organizations broadly, we tend to enact human resource management practices that are applicable to everyone, right? And when you have those inflexible policies and procedures and practices in place, that effectively discriminates against individuals who do need an accommodation. In order to be truly neuroinclusive, I feel like you just have to be more flexible when thinking about these, overarching policies and procedures, and you have to be more overtly accommodation friendly in the organization. So reverse discrimination is a little more complicated. So as written, I believe reverse discrimination is talking about overtly, consciously perceiving that reasonable accommodation of a minority group shifts privilege to that group. And when you take that stance overtly, that is effectively an anti-affirmative action stance, right? But I think that it's largely unconscious bias on the part of most employees, because a person with an invisible disability does not have to disclose to their coworkers and their peers. If you want a reasonable accommodation, you do have to disclose to your manager and human resources. While they may have to share with some individuals in an organization, like safety personnel, for example, it's still considered confidential. You can request that reasonable accommodation and disclose to your supervisor, to leadership, but they cannot share that information with your peers unless you are willing to do so. So if you get a reasonable accommodation and you do not disclose to your peers, it might be perceived as preferential treatment and favoritism, right? And that's where I really feel like education at all levels of the organization, from staff to university or library leadership, you have to educate people about neurodiversity, about disabilities, invisible disabilities, explain the accommodation process, that things do not have to be disclosed, and let people know if someone is has a different work setup or different hours or whatever, there's a reason for that, right? It's not arbitrary, and they will have a better idea of why. So the only slide I really have under this section of disability is a comparison of the medical model and social model, which many of you may already be aware of, given, your particular area of librarianship. These are not the only models, but they are sort of the extremes of models of disability. So the medical model is really what the Americans with Disabilities Act is based on. It's a very pathologizing deficit model. It really focuses on disability residing in the individual who needs to be treated to get better, to be able to fit into societal norms, right? The social model, it really looks at human variation across the board. So cognitive difference is normal, right? I mean, no one thinks the same, behaves the same. That is natural. It's strengths-based. It really looks at disability as socially constructed, focuses on impairment over disability. And it was sort of born of the neurodiversity movement in the late 90s that I have already mentioned. There are more recent models that try to find, a bridge between these two models, which are sort of on extreme ends of the models of disability spectrum, but I wanted to at least point them out. So let me check my time. Oh my goodness. All right. So disability law, affirmative action, and reasonable accommodations. After I presented at the Conference on Academic Library Management in June, I did this presentation for all of the employees at WashU Libraries where I am. And I asked questions. I sent out an anonymous survey beforehand asking, what questions do you have if you're a neurodiverse employee, if you were a neurodiverse manager, or if you were a manager of neurodiverse employees, or could be in the future. And by large, the most common question asked was around reasonable accommodation, because it is very complicated. Peter Blank, who I have listed down here below this slide, is an expert in the field. His book, Disability Law and Policy, is amazing. It has informed a lot of my work in this area. So I highly recommend that you look him up if you're interested in this. So why is disability law complicated? It's complicated because it is statutory. So what that means, there is not like this, law based on the Constitution that applies to everyone across the board in the United States. It's derived primarily from federal and state laws and policies, which could vary greatly from state to state. They're handled on a case-by-case basis. And, as I've already said, there are no mandated reasonable accommodations. I do believe that the fact that disability law is complicated has been used as an excuse historically by organizations not to provide guidance in this area. But I just don't think that is a valid excuse anymore. So I'm going to point out 4 different acts, laws that are relevant here. So the Rehabilitation Act, that's where it all started in 1973. It really pertained to federal contractors and programs receiving federal funds. The Americans with Disabilities Act, 1990, we're talking about Title I. If you work in a university, you probably hear more talk about Title II, because that's really where student protections come in. But Title I is what we're talking about here. In 2008, there was an amendment to ADA, which made it easier for people to be qualified as disabled under the law, because employers were using the very strict definition of disability in original ADA to get out of these lawsuits for not fairly accommodating employees. And this is really interesting here. I'm very interested in this Rehabilitation Act, Section 503. I'm not going to talk about it for long, but all employers with federal contracts have to have an affirmative action program in place that aspires to having a 7% or higher disabled workforce. They, if they don't make it, that's not, necessarily a problem if they are actively working on that plan. So where I am right now at Washington University of St. Louis, I'm talking to people in our Office of Institutional Equity because we have no language anywhere that I can find that we are complying with this requirement. So that is something that I'm working on now. So reasonable accommodation, who qualifies? Full-time, part-time, and provisional employees are entitled to reasonable accommodation through ADA. And you are entitled to that accommodation even if you are capable of performing the essential functions of the job without it, right? If you've been in an organization for 5 years and you've been doing the job but struggling for whatever reason because you do not have that accommodation, you can still apply formally for an accommodation. They can't say, because you have done it okay without this accommodation for 5 years, you can't apply for one now. That is not the case. So the process, an employee has to disclose at least to your manager and HR to be eligible for an accommodation, but that can be kept confidential for the most part from the rest of the staff in the organization. ADA encourages a flexible, consultative, interactive process, that is legal language there, between the employer and employee to decide on what the appropriate accommodation is. And if that fails, then an employee can bring a failure to accommodate claim under ADA Title I. So undue hardship, I want to point out, because the one way that an organization or business, like whatever, can get out of accommodating is if they claim undue hardship. So this is a significant difficulty or expense on the part of an employer when considered in light of various factors. It is largely, from what I've read on ADA law, a financial restraint. So typically, like an organization or a business, whatever, may say, we simply cannot afford to tear down a wall, or, to install some other kind of really financial resource heavy project. But that is really where undue hardship has the strongest case. But an employer cannot reject outright any accommodation request. They have to go through that interactive process. The employer has the burden of showing, it's highly fact intensive, I think the last slide said that the accommodation will cause undue hardship on the organization. And undue hardship cannot be argued based on other employees' fears, prejudices, or reverse discrimination. You can't say, I can't let you have a different schedule because everybody else is going to perceive it as unfair. That does not qualify as undue hardship. So that is something I think it's really important to make note of. All right, so this is an example because I think attendance is something that has come up a lot when I talk about neurodiversity and reasonable accommodation. So while workplace attendance itself is not subject to reasonable accommodation, some points have been made and proven in court cases where people have filed failure to accommodate claims. Attendance on site is not essential for all jobs. I think we all know that, right? Post-COVID, because many businesses and libraries, organizations were able to successfully function with people not on site. Full-time attendance is not essential for all jobs. Starting at a given time every day is not essential for all jobs. And strictly regulated breaks. I point those out because, as I said, these things have been determined in actual ADA claim cases. And it is incumbent on the employer to provide evidence that policies and refusal to accommodate are essential for the job. This, there could be a whole session just on job descriptions, right? Because we tend to put all the things in a job description we want of the ideal candidate for a job. But really, reasonable accommodation is all about essential functions for accomplishing your job. So two very quick, what time is it? How much time do we have? Two very quick neuro-friendly recommendations that I have found that I think are really exciting ideas. All happen around onboarding. So including a communication style survey for all new employees during onboarding. You ask questions like, I can easily introduce myself at social meetings, right? There might be, I will never attend a staff party, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, I will be the one who always volunteers to plan the staff party, right? And if you ask these questions of all individuals when they are hired, then it provides an opportunity for managers and supervisors to have a conversation, whether a person discloses a neurodiversity or not, whether a person knows that they have a neurodiverse condition or not. This is something I feel like would be helpful for all individuals in a library, right? In this case. Another onboarding thing that I feel like people can do is provide a feedback preference survey during onboarding. And this would be a conversation between an employee and their manager, right? I want feedback immediately. If I do something that you find unacceptable, I want to know now, right? Or I really prefer, to get feedback at our regular one-on-one meeting however often you have that. Tone of voice and body language matter to me, or they don't matter to me. I feel like asking these kind of questions, again, just as with the communication style survey, that's something that you can apply across the board to everybody without requiring anyone to disclose anything. And I feel like it sort of helps set people up for success from the beginning, rather than waiting until you perceive as a manager there's a problem, and then things just degenerate from there. So I do have a few minutes. Honestly, I'm not sure. Deborah, Aisha,
we have like you have like until 1:45 if you need it. We have just a few questions, so if you need a few more minutes, you're good to go.
1:45. Okay, so I'll just go through a couple of these. There are 3 or 4, depending on what you read, aspects of organizational justice. Distributive justice and procedural justice are the aspects that I think are the most important in this context. So distributive justice it can be perceptions of equality or equity. And this is where it's really important to understand that equity for neurodiversity means accommodation, right? And accommodation, if you're not disclosing, may not be perceived as equality. I feel like it's just really important, when you're thinking about how you are handling matters, personnel matters, HR policies in an organization. This is where education and training is so important, right? For people to understand distributive justice, if you are neuroinclusive organization, is perceptions of equity. And I feel like you really have to train people at all levels appropriately to understand that equity for neurodiversity means accommodation. And procedural justice, that's really talking about perceptions of fairness in the decision-making process. And again, that education's very important there. And I would also say that one aspect of procedural justice is including the affected individuals in decision-making processes, right? So, an example I use is if you are an anti-racist organization, right, which WashU is officially not, I found out this week. When you're having conversations around implementation of that identification, right? You want to include individuals who are affected by those policies and decisions. I would argue the same goes for neurodiversity. The challenge with that is you aren't always going to know who neurodiverse individuals in an organization are, right? I feel like if you're going to make, policies and procedures around neuroinclusion and reasonable accommodation and, making more flexible policies to accommodate reasonable accommodation, you really need to include the voices of those neurodiverse individuals. And I think the only way you can do that is really by overtly committing to neuroinclusion in the workplace and, making a psychologically safe space where people really do feel like they are not going to face negative repercussions by disclosing their neurodiverse identity. So I'm not going to go through these. This is a great article. I put this in here, and Preslova also has a book coming out on this topic. And she has developed something called the Canary Code that really talks about people participating in the work design process around accommodation, focusing on outcomes over process. If you can get the job done, coming in an hour later and working an hour later, then, you are accomplishing the outcomes expected of you, right? Being very flexible. Organizational justice, again, is very important. Transparency and clear communication. I think all organizations struggle with that at some level. And creating valid tools for decision making. I've got a link to this article I highly recommend. It's quite short. So I added this quote because I think it is really meaningful to me. So the person who wrote this quote is an autistic behavioral specialist, right? And she said, I don't melt down because I'm autistic. I melt down because something in my environment is intolerable and I'm having a normal reaction to pain and or anxiety. I feel like, we have to educate people about what being neuroinclusive really means. And I've got a section on concepts and keywords, which I thought everybody would appreciate. I disclosed before this started, these are not mesh terms, but these are some terms that you might be able to use if you're interested in looking into this more after this session. And then some of the references that I used for this presentation. My email is here and my Twitter handle. If you are interested in working in this space, I know some of you already are, if you would like to collaborate, if you want to talk, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me that way as well. And I would love to talk more about this because I really am quite passionate about it. So that is me.
Thank you so much. You've had some
Sure.
really good interaction in the chat. A lot of people are just expressing gratitude that you're so willing to share your own personal experiences, but we also have several questions that have been coming in.
Sure,
So
please. Here, I'm going to stop sharing, but I can pull it back up if I need to.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the first question was, how does Title VII relate to disabilities?
Title VII? or Title One?
Somebody put
It's
Title VII.
it's me,
Same.
Megan. I put Title VII because, like, if you put in a complaint through the university about harassment, it's done through, even if it's like a
Title-
disability, it's done through Title VII. So I didn't know how that. I don't know enough about sort of like the Title I, Title II. Like, I don't know enough about them to know
Well,
like why
Title
that.
One, that's ADA. I think Title VII is yet another sort of policy to work through. Is this Clara?
This is
Fowler?
Megan.
Oh, Megan. Hi, Megan. I just saw Claire Fowler. I think Claire's in Houston, or used to be. But I don't know, Megan. I'll have to look into that, where the overlap is with Title VII. I see Claire.
Thank you.
Where Title VII is. But this is something, what I'm going to do, I'm going to write down some of these questions I don't have an answer to, and I would be happy to share them out somehow with this group, if that's possible. Maybe all the people who registered, I would be happy to follow up with that. But I can't answer that question right off the top of my head.
That's okay. I'm sure people will be wonderful for follow-up. We are able to send out a follow-up. We do send out an email within 2 weeks, and we can add whatever you would like into that.
Sure.
Yeah. So let's get on to the next question.
Okay.
Somebody asked, what is considered employer in the case of the university? Your direct supervisor or HR?
That's a great question. So what I have found at WashU, which is where I've done all this work, there is not always a very close connection between library HR and university central HR, right? I mean, for reasonable accommodation, typically you would go through the process in the library, and then they would connect you with central HR to work through the process. But I can tell you from conversations I've had with individuals who have struggled with this, even HR at the university level, at least in my case currently, are not terribly well educated about what reasonable accommodations are in ADA law. I feel like that it's really important to educate yourself so that you don't get sort of pushed aside and told, well, that, we can't do that, because things like the attendance examples I gave, attendance is a huge issue. And I know for a fact that people have been told things that are not correct in terms of what is acceptable or not acceptable. I'm telling you, that book, ADA Law and Policy by Peter Blank, I buy it, I bought it, it's all marked up. It is amazing. It's very easy to understand. It talks about the other titles too, but I think it has really solid sections on Title I.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to combine the next two. Someone asked if the recommendation to disclose is during or after the hiring process. And someone else said, how do you ensure the answers to these questions don't weaponize discrimination?
You can disclose at any time. You can work at an organization for 25 years and decide you need a reasonable accommodation. I mean, I was 40 years old before I was even diagnosed with ADHD, right? So like, no one can, and like I said, when I was talking about reasonable accommodation, claiming that you've done a job well enough without it is not justification for not accommodating your request. Did that answer the whole question? What else?
Just maybe if you have some thoughts about how we can ensure employee answers don't get weaponized for further discrimination. That's a tough one.
I mean, disclosure is really complicated because people have experience. While the literature I've read has been largely favorable around disclosure, there are people who have had negative repercussions, right? So it is a very personal decision. I am not saying everybody should disclose, irrespective of the circumstance, because, one of the challenges And one of the reasons I think education around this is so important at all levels of an organization is because it really, how you are treated is really going to depend on, your immediate supervisor and, library leadership. And one supervisor in a library might handle things completely different than another, right? So, it is an important decision. Like I said, you can disclose and to your manager, request an accommodation without that being disclosed to your peers and things. That can come with other challenges, as I said. But disclosure, it is really, I mean, I am a pretty assertive person. And I am a person who is willing to push through and make things happen, but not everybody's comfortable doing that, right? So I would never say everybody should disclose. If you plan on disclosing, I would really do your research around the reasonable accommodation process, even like in your state, because it could vary widely from state to state, how cases are handled and things like that. Just know that failure to accommodate, from what I have read, is justified primarily through financial burdens on the organization. Not like, we can't do this for you because we're not doing it for everybody else, is not a valid excuse not to accommodate.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Someone else wanted to know a little bit about, did you come up with these surveys, like the feedback preference survey, or are these from someone else, like articles or books? They're really interested in being able to share that and possibly use it in the future.
So I noticed I've got a link to the feedback survey that I found as an example, and I didn't have a link for the communication survey. I will look for that. This was really, I did not come up with them myself. I wish I could claim to have done so, but I did not. It really was just me searching everywhere. It's so hard when you're looking for information because, when you're talking about something like neurodiversity, there are all these organizations that want to sell you things, right? But there is information out there about things like this. You just have to really dig for it. So I will look for that, and I'll include the link in my follow-up.
Along that line, someone did ask, they said they love your slides, and is there a program you can recommend for slide creation?
Oh, wow. Though, do you know what one of my biggest frustrations with doing presentation sessions on neurodiversity is there are so few graphics out there that capture neurodiversity, their disability, right? It's always a person in a wheelchair or a person with a cane. But, if you are creative and you have ideas about how to visualize neurodiversity, there is an opportunity for you, because it has been one of my biggest frustrations. The lack of, everything from clip art to photographs to, everything else. But thank you. I've worked hard. And my PowerPoint skills are increasing greatly doing this work. So I appreciate it.
On a totally different vein, someone was wanting to know about communication. Like, do you have recommendations on how employees can communicate with coworkers or administration who might view them differently, possibly unprofessional, et cetera, due to knowing about their neurodiversity?
Well, so I'm going to give you how I feel about this. But again, I'm not suggesting this for everyone. But for me, I did have a lot of struggles in 2021 and 2022. And what I will say is that my passion around becoming a neuroinclusive manager at COM was based on my experiences with neuroinclusion in the workplace. That's really all I'm going to say about that. But I feel like even putting ADHD in my pronoun statement. When people log on to a meeting with me, they see that, right? And I did have questions when I sent out the survey to the library folks before I did my presentation. I did get questions around, you know, how can I disclose to my peers, you know, if I'm put on a team with someone or a group of people about, you know, why, like personally, I'm the person who can't shut up, you know, but there are people who are on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Like they have all the ideas, but they're not comfortable speaking up, right? And I feel like coming up, even with like community agreements, if you don't want to disclose every time, because this hasn't, maybe it's happening more, but it hasn't happened a lot in my experience in libraries. You know, when you put a new group together, do a lot of forming. I don't know if you know, like forming through adjourning, right? The 5 or 6 step process, forming, storming, norming, performing, adjourning. What I have realized is I have not historically put enough effort into forming. And I feel like if you put effort in up front when you're in a group and you collectively talk about things like community agreements, you can express, you know, how you communicate differently without necessarily disclosing. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like there are ways to build groups that are neuro-inclusive without requiring that people say, or having ADHD like in your face, right, on a Zoom screen. Yeah, so that's what I would say. I mean, evidence has shown overwhelmingly that neuro-inclusive practices and accommodation-friendly approaches help everyone in an organization, not just the people who identify as neurodiverse. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I think that's a lovely place to wrap up, because we really support like universal design, and it's just like using those same principles to be universal in the way we approach everything that we do in our work. We try that in Region 2 as much as possible. I wanted to let everybody.
Question. Will I have access to the chats? Because I would love to read through them and be able, because if I see other questions, I'll try to include responses in my.
Absolutely. There were 3 I know of that we didn't get to.
Okay,
so we'll make sure that you get that.
And if you have other questions that you're not comfortable putting in a chat that everybody can see, email me, please. Christy.peters@woostel.edu, LinkedIn, whatever. You can connect to me anyway. I would be thrilled to talk to you.
That means a lot, because some of these questions might be really sensitive. So I really appreciate you being open.
It is a sensitive topic, sure.
Yeah. So I wanted to let you guys know, people have been asking all along. You will be getting an email within 2 weeks that has the survey, it has the recording, and make sure that if you want to receive your MLACE credit, that you do download it at the end of your survey. In this, we appreciate you always participating in the survey to help us improve our programming. The recorded event will be in YouTube. So we're going to stop recording now.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.